This is Away, Series 2, a fresh approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 3. In episode 2, we examined one of AA's most important predecessors, the Washingtonians, named for George Washington. And we caught up Bill's and Bob's timelines. In this episode, I want to introduce a few more key characters in our story. More briefly, I hope, so that we can get to the good stuff. Before we delve back into the story, though, I want to take a few minutes to review why I'm doing this at all. The idea for this podcast began not too long ago after a conversation with John S., the very talented man behind AA Beyond Belief podcast. I'm a huge fan of him and his website. I'm not someone who shies away from conflict, especially when it's constructive. But that's not true for a lot of people. I think that without sites like AA Beyond Belief and AA Agnostica, too many people would feel far too alone in the rooms of AA. The very rooms in which you're meant to always feel accepted. Before being interviewed by John, I'll put the link in the description, I'd been overcome with anger at the fundamentalists who'd hijacked my then home group. I could see or foresee the destruction they would cause, having been witness to it in other groups. They were overly zealous newcomers who were turning AA into a religion which it is not meant to be, not ever. They were trying to make Bill into a saint. They said, still say, things like, "You're doomed to drink again if you don't find God." Wow, so helpful, huh? Death sentence? It's also patently false. I did my part, each to his own. I would raise my hand and share to remind everyone in the room that God is not a requirement. I held my head up when they would say the Lord's Prayer at the end of the meeting. Not because the Lord's Prayer offends me. It doesn't when it's in church. But because I wanted a fearful newcomer to know that saying it wasn't a requirement either. I don't chant with the others. That's my dog. Trying to get attention. I don't chant with the others when certain things are read because it makes AA seem like something it isn't. I went to business meetings, yada, yada, yada. Nothing changed except that I was staying angry. The angrier I am, the less capable I am of helping anyone. Ultimately, my response to the smug fundamentalists was this podcast. Seems like a relatively healthy response and has yet to involve any yelling. Yet. The first series was just a very basic way through the big book, very simply reframed for the atheist or agnostic, or for a believer who just wanted to be able to help a non-believer. I think the zealots help fewer people in the end, and may even be more destructive than that. I decided to do a second series around the big book, but with a slightly different intention, to address not just the religious aspects, but the sexism, racism, misogyny. After some thoughtful emails, I decided to attempt to reframe as many of the antiquated ideas in the book that seem to many of us completely inaccessible. Here are some examples of things in the book that were useless to me, even while others seemed to identify. A life lived on self-will can hardly be a success. Actually, mine's going great now that I'm exercising some self-will and discipline. We are self-centered and egocentric. Not all of us. Sometimes in the midst of an addiction, we behaved in those ways. But selfish behavior or bad behavior is not the same thing as being a selfish or bad person. Not always, at least. Selfishness is the root of our troubles. Nope, wasn't the root of mine. We had been playing God. Never. I was not self-pitying, but nor did I for 1 minute think of myself as better than anyone else, above them in any way. That's bullshit. There are also a lot of slogans that people find acceptable because tradition, which, tradition's not actually an argument. A lot of things were tradition that are, not acceptable by today's standards. In any case, the first one, think, it's usually upside down. There's a lot of theories about what it's meant to imply. It's dumb. But for the grace of God. Sure, for you, maybe. But if you don't believe in God, if it works, don't fix it. I mean, this one is asinine always, right? If we always said that, then nothing new would ever happen. Question everything. Some of us are sicker than others. Wow. I thought we were shooting for humility here, guys. Seems like a good thing to say if putting people down boosts you up. I'm not down with it. It also sweeps under the carpet some sickness that isn't sickness, but sociopathy or psychopathy. The road to sobriety is a simple journey for confused people with a complicated disease. Simple journey? I mean, relatively speaking, yes. Not at first and not always, but okay. Confused? Not me. Sure, when I didn't know how to stop drinking, but then I learned, mostly I'm not confused by very much anymore. I mean, it's life. Every human is trying to figure this shit out. And the disease isn't so complicated. Maybe some of us aren't smart enough to understand the whole picture, but that doesn't mean it's all that complicated. Finally, expect miracles. No. Work hard to change by setting small, achievable goals. Start with abstaining from alcohol. The miracle? There's no miracle. You stop drinking. No one does it for you. You do it. You do it by reaching each of those small, day-long goals. It's not a miracle. It's you. How's that for self-centered? Okay, sorry, enough with the rant. Not saying it won't happen again. We've got 164 plus pages to get through. Where were we? Alrighty. We're going to circle back a little bit again so you know the other supporting characters in the story. A lot of people played important parts leading up to that first meeting between Bill and Bob at the Seiberling Estate in Akron, Ohio. And I previously mentioned a few of their names because they were all born in the late 19th century. Let's start with EBI Thatcher, born Edwin Throckmorton, April 29, 1896 in Albany, New York. As children, he and Lois actually knew each other, family, friends, but he didn't meet Bill really until boarding school in 1911. That's when their friendship begins to develop. As Ebby's life progresses, it becomes clear that he's an alcoholic. His family business fails in 1922 and 1929. He goes on a infamous drinking spree with Bill where they end up chartering a plane to Manchester. I mean, my kind of drinking story. Long story short, it's in Manchester, Vermont, only 6 years later that Ebby is approached by two old drinking buddies, Sebra and Shep, who want to help him sober up. They're already members of the Oxford group and staying sober with it. More on the Oxford group a bit later. Ebby's not ready, but soon enough, he has no choice. 1934, he is facing criminal charges, something his pals Sebra and Shep learned about through their old pal, Roland Hazard. And he's another great character. So these two show up at court, and they persuade the trial judge to parole Ebby into their custody. Now, I'm not sure this would have happened if the judge hadn't been Sebra's dad, but he was, and this did happen. And this is where we start to see, in part, what people in AA refer to as synchronicity, right? Everything just seems to fall into place. I'd argue that it didn't seem that way to any of them at the time, but God was doing for them what they could not do for themselves, I suppose, as religious folks might say. Anyway, just 2 months after the court drama, Roland introduces Ebby to the Oxford group. It's this connection that ultimately brings Ebby to the Calvary Rescue Mission in New York City. But let's flash back to 1925. Sam Shoemaker becomes a rector of the Calvary Episcopalian Church. This was a meeting place for the Oxford groups in New York, and it had also become, by 1926, with the help of a man named Harry Hadley, a rescue mission for Bowery drunks, basically. But it was way back in 19 on a trip abroad when Sam Shoemaker met a man named Frank Buckman, a Lutheran minister who, after a profound spiritual experience, was born again and created the Oxford group's predecessor, the First Century Christian Fellowship. Sam had a similar experience and became a devotee of Buckman's, thus the mission in New York. But it's Buckman himself who gave the Oxford group, in essence, to Akron, Ohio. And that's, in many ways, where things really got going. But wait, what the hell is the Oxford group? So, as I just said, it began as the First Century Christian Fellowship, an evangelical movement led by Frank Buckman that garnered attention from around the world. They received international publicity during the 20s and 30s, according to Arthur S., the William White Papers. The primary principles of the group, not named Oxford until later, consisted of ideas that are going to sound very familiar to you if you've read the steps. The 4 absolutes of honesty, unselfishness, purity, and love. These were believed to be derived from Scripture in the Sermon on the Mount. The 5 C's of confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. The 5 procedures. 1, give in to God. 2, listen to God's direction. 3, check guidance. 4, restitution. And 5, sharing for witness and confession. Now, this is where I'd argue, again, you can see the influence in the steps in the Big Book. And this is where I'd ask you to remember the context of time. Clearly, the writers of the Big Book were trying the best they knew how, I suppose. I'm sure some of them were just assholes. But were trying to be more open-minded and to be better and to give similar ideas to more people. So there were some failures, but there were also some successes. Okay, going back. Now remember that Roland fella who introduced Ebby to the Oxford group in 1934. 8 years prior, bumping along his brutal bottom, Roland was looking for HELP from a shrink. That's pretty forward thinking. He has 3 guys in mind, who you may remember from the last episode: Freud, Jung, and Adler. Freud and Adler aren't taking any new patients, but Jung, he's all in. Taking new patients, takes insurance. That's a joke. I don't think insurance like that existed then. I think that was a lot after World War II. Many people say that if Roland had seen either of the other doctors, we wouldn't have AA, or at least we wouldn't have it as it is, and maybe that's true. But I'm not a fan of magical thinking, as you know. Regardless, some of Jung's theories do have an impact on the program of AA because they have an impact on Roland. So Jung tells him that basically he's doomed to an alcoholic death. He says that he's never seen anyone recover who's in a state like Roland, that the only way he believes a man can recover from this disease is by having a vital spiritual experience. I think every single person has a unique take on everything he or she hears, right? Millions of things affect how we perceive everything, from words to music. So vital spiritual experience via Roland becomes solely its supernatural experience. I honestly don't know what Jung had in mind. I haven't delved into that fully yet. But that is how it arrived to the Oxford group and to us. The thing is, and I talked about this a little in the previous series, a vital spiritual experience doesn't have to have anything to do with anything supernatural. It can mean a complete shift in moral psychology, a complete overhaul of the way you think and react. And if you are just starting out on this journey, set aside the struggle with God for now, if you're struggling at all, and just try to change one thing, the way you think about alcohol. If you thought it was a medicine, now think of it as a poison. You thought it was helping your anxiety, now you know it was contributing. You thought you could have just one, now you know you can't. Complete overhaul of the way you think about alcohol or drugs to start. The rest can wait, in my humble opinion. It's also Jung who coined the term synchronicity. Think of it almost like the butterfly effect, I guess, but not really. In the case of AA, a lot of people see it as, meant to be. Each thing happened just as God planned it, or something like that. But I want to actually tug a little bit more on the word synchronicity. Jung believed in a collective unconscious. Nothing supernatural about it. A level of consciousness or unconsciousness we all share. If you think about it, I don't know, like the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who experience much of the PTSD of their grandparents. In part, I'm sure the household of a survivor of genocide will be different, the emotions, the fear. But two, many people argue, and I agree, that it's also now become a part of their DNA. I think this is true for the children and grandchildren of slaves, too, or how indigenous people often know their way around without ever having been in a place. Not a miracle. Science. I don't know that much about it. The brain, we don't fully understand yet. So maybe, and I'm just throwing this out there, maybe Jung doesn't mean anything preternatural or unearthly at all. In fact, in his view, this is all of the mind. But I'm off track again. Let's see. We've got Ebby and Bill. Ebby learns of Bill's continuing alcoholism while at the Calvary Rescue Mission with Roland. It's November of 1934. He calls Lois. He ends up stopping by a few times to talk with Bill. One of those nights, he stays for dinner, begins to tell Bill about the Oxford group. Bill is still drinking. And while Bill isn't impressed, he does go downtown to investigate the Calvary rescue. Of course, he gets drunk en route. By mid-December of 34, Bill is back at Towns Hospital. Dr. William Silkworth, the author of the letter in the doctor's opinion, was in charge of what became known as the Little Hospital for Drunks, Towns Hospital. It's in that hospital that Bill finally really hears Ebby's message and has what he calls a white light experience. I want to say here clearly that if you're a believer or you wish to be, this kind of experience is very unusual. My experience has taught me that most people come to God or whatever they describe as a higher power slowly. It's a relationship that develops and grows as it also becomes more personal, deeper. It's true for non-believers too, who often find practices of mindfulness fulfilling, and those practices become deeper and more intense with time. Bill is actually fearful that he's gone mad and talks to Silky. Silky thought it couldn't be any worse than where the booze had brought him, so Bill felt reassured. It's the next day that Ebby brings him William James's book, Varieties of a Religious Experience, which we briefly looked at in the previous episode. The three things that struck Bill as most important for the spiritual experience were a need for complete defeat in a vital area of life. So we might think of that as hitting our bottom. 2, an admission of defeat. So that's the same as acceptance. 3, an appeal to a higher power for help, aka surrender. These are obviously the principles that later inform steps 1, 2, and 3. The book, as we discussed earlier, strongly influenced the founders of AA. So, Bill understands from Ebby that working with others is the key to staying sober. And he starts to do just that. But let's back up again. Okay, so we have the Oxford group. They make a trip with Frank at the helm to Akron because a Big Shot member, Jim Newton, has introduced Sam Shoemaker and Bud Firestone, the son of the Rubber King himself, Harvey Firestone. Bud needs help. Frank and his troop come to Akron to do just that. Dr. Bob and his wife Anne live in Akron, so do the Williams. The Williams host Oxford group meetings in their home. Anne, Bob's wife, has been going to the meetings of the group with her friend Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta's marriage was crumbling, and the group gave her new direction and focus, and she actually began something called the Alcoholic Squad. And some credit her as a founder of AA. So, and I'll get into more details of this in a later episode, Bill goes to Akron on business. He wants to drink when he's at the hotel. He knows his best weapon is to find another alcoholic. He goes through all the numbers in the directory in Akron until he finally reaches someone, the Reverend Tunks, who tells him to call Henrietta. Henrietta's been confiding in him as part of the Oxford group. Bill calls her. Her relief is palpable. She's been waiting for someone to help Dr. Bob, her best friend's husband. She brings Bill and Bob together at her home in the now famous gatehouse. And there we have the first meeting, so to speak, of AA. One alcoholic talking to another. Empathy and kindness. That's all they each needed. There are so many details in this story that I have ignored and so many more that I will ignore. And, I'm sure to get an angry email about how I missed out on a very important detail about the time, blah, blah, blah. But honestly, even I'm getting bored. So let's say this for now. Whatever you believe, why all these things happened, they happened. They were where they were, and in the end, no matter how they got there, it was because other people gave a shit about them, about the world. Kindness matters. Empathy matters. Compassion matters. I don't know exactly what was said when they talked, but I have to assume there wasn't a lot of preaching or anger, no musts, no talk of those selfish defects, just sharing their experiences. As we go through the book and some of the angrier language comes up, some of the antiquated approaches, I beg of you to remember the most basic truth of AA. One alcoholic talking to another. Empathy and kindness. Acceptance, compassion. I'll end this episode with the responsibility pledge, because to me that is the only thing that matters, maybe besides the preamble, and the only statement that should be made to close a meeting. I am responsible when anyone, anywhere, reaches out for help. I want the hand of AA always to be there. For that, I am responsible. In the next episode, we will finally start the doctor's opinion, and I'll be a lot less detail-oriented historically unless it's necessary. What I want ultimately is to make the only text we have at the moment accessible and a little less offensive to anyone who wants to give it a shot. So, thanks for listening. I hope I've helped. As ever, remember, no matter what, there is a way.